Yeah, I was going to start off here. Let's see if I can get the slide up. Just a few things. At one point in my life, I was a philosopher, so I know that I don't have what would amount to an ethical theory on any of this. But I was going to, and I don't think I even have an informal ethical theory, but I wanted to just back up with try to frame a few things here that may be relevant to the ethics of this. And if we could go to the first slide. And it's sorry, the second slide. Oh yeah, I can do that myself. Yes. All right. So the idea is that, look, we keep talking about all of these technological ways in which we may be able to become further advanced, but we're already superhuman. So if aliens were to come down and look at us today and the kinds of things that we can do compared to our genetically identical, practically identical relatives 200,000 years ago, they'd be amazed to find that we're genetically identical because we're completely different sorts of creatures. And so it's best to think of us as human 2.0s today, not human 1.0s at all. And what makes us 2.0, and it's not genetic, it's not natural selection differences, it's something else. So it's hard. What is it that makes us so different from these other apes and chimpanzee and so forth? And the things, the technologies that are the ones that really revolutionize what it is to be human are often exactly the invisible ones. They're not the ones that you can point to and you say, oh, look at that person's wearing that technology. Those are the ones that are probably not, in fact, revolutionizing anything. The ones that are really deep are the ones you just don't notice. And I'll give you examples of what I mean. And they're also the sorts of things that they're so much of a part of us that when we define what it is to be human, we absorb those things into ourselves. That is, it becomes what it is to be human. So for example, if you were to say, what is it that makes us human relative to the other apes, then some of the things that come to mind are going to be things like literacy, having language, having music, having arts. And potentially, there's different views upon where these things came from, but in my view, all of these things are in fact cultural artifacts, and I have a very similar story to how all of these things came about. And so in the case of writing, and I'm just going to give you a flavor of it very quickly, the reason that all of us can read is, we know, not because we evolved to read. It's much too recent that it was invented, and you just have to go a couple generations back in any of your lines, and you'll find all of your ancestors being illiterate. We can read as well as we do, and we can read incredibly early with relatively little training, and it pervades our lives. And so if aliens were to see us, they'd say, oh, these creatures clearly evolved to read. But we didn't evolve to read, and we even have visual word form areas in our head. But of course, no one's confused into thinking that it's really that, but aliens might be confused at first, right? The reason it looks as if we have an instinct or a language, a reading organ in your brain, is because cultural evolution over time has shaped the structure of writing to look like nature in a particular rigorous respect. So one of my areas of research, I've shown that writing systems across humankind have the kinds of conglomerations of contours that you find in natural scenes, namely with opaque objects strewn about. You end up with certain kinds of conglomeration, topological conglomerations of contours, and other kinds you don't find. So the reason we can read at all is only because culture has twisted the shapes of writing to be exactly the sorts of things that apes like us can process, and it harnesses our visual object recognition system, and it turns it into a reading system. And I've made similar arguments in my book for the origins of spoken language and your speech processing. That is, the sounds of speech sound like the fundamental grammatical sounds that you find amongst solid objects in the world. And the sounds of music, in fact, have the kinds of structure that you find in the sounds of humans moving about you. These are, again, talents that your auditory system would have evolved over long epochs to have great processing in the world around you. So what these are, literacy, or reading, speech, music, the arts, are in fact technologies. We don't even think of them as technologies, right? They pervade you, so they're just so part of who we are that we even define ourselves as having these things. But these are the big game changers. And so there's a couple implications here. One is that we're already there. We're already way beyond, we're already super relative to our genetically identical ancestors. And my claim is that when we find what's next after our current human 2.0 selves, that is, the question is, what are the human 3.0s going to be like? it's not going to be X-Men-like. It's not going to be Spider-Man-like. It's not going to be singularity. It's not going to require that we fully understand the brain and go beyond it. The reason that we are already effectively having this huge gulf between us and our genetically identical human 1.0 selves is because of this, what I call nature harnessing, or Stan Dehaney calls neuronal recycling, this harnessing your past brilliant packets in your body and pointing them in new directions. These are how we got to be the way we are today, and the stuff that's going to really revolutionize us is going to be that sort of thing. Now, some of these technologies may have that stuff within them. The new thing that's going to make us some radical new kind of creature may in fact be amongst all of these technologies that we're using today, but we don't appreciate it. Just like writing was being used by clerics and accountants for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years in many cases before anybody thought that this would catch on. So it's unclear where, but so that's, this gives a different kind of impression, my claim, for how to even think about technology and where to expect the really big stuff. All right, so let me stop there and let you go, Mark, next.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I don't have any slides. The schedule indicates this is an ethics panel, but I was reassured yesterday at the speakers meeting that this really is a panel to try to catch up on a range of social implications associated with being superhuman. And I'm glad that that's the case, and it's not just an ethics panel, because the organizers instructed me not to have any prepared remarks on ethics. I was told to discuss legal implications of being superhuman, so that's what I'm going to do. But maybe afterwards, when we have some discussion, I might chime in on some of the ethical issues. I would like to make just a few preliminary points before I get to some very specific legal implications. And one is, it's very important to remember that the law is a blunt instrument. Laws are not made for you or me. They're not individualized. They're made for sort of population groups. Some laws may be made for an entire society, some for segments of that society. So therefore, if you're thinking about making laws that would in some way control the development of science and the applications through technology, it's very important to keep in mind what the impacts of those laws are likely to be. If we've learned anything from people who do innovation, it is that they really appreciate a stable legal environment. They want to know as clearly as possible what the expectations are of them. What will they be held accountable for? What will happen if some law is violated? All of these things are really important for entrepreneurial advancement. And the business community will time and time tell you again, they want clarity in whatever laws are passed. They hope, of course, the laws are favorable to them, as we all do whenever we're involved in debates about laws. But nevertheless, they want something that's stable that they could sort of count on. Second preliminary point I want to make is that as science and technology evolve and as the law evolves, so does the context. So when you're thinking about the legal implications of anything, you can think about the here and now, and you can think about 10 years from now or 20 years from now, whatever the case might be. So for example, if you're thinking about laws affecting superhumans in the workplace, it would be best if you knew what work was going to look like before you decided to pass any laws. You may think you know what it will look like in 5 years. You may have really no idea of what it will look like in 20 years. You can say the same thing for education and any other sector, if you will. So think of implications in terms of context. Context is very important. Unfortunately, the law is not very good in thinking forward. Law is very conservative. Court decisions are made based on precedents. Professor Damasio spoke this morning about two cultures, the humanities and arts on one hand and science and technology on the other. Well, within the humanities and arts is the law. You talk about two cultures that are very different. Think about how the law works and operates, and think about how science operates. Really very different. It's amazing that they get along at all. And of course, if you happen to be in science or in technological applications, there are probably cases where you're cursing the law. You don't think it's doing the right thing in order to promote whatever it is that you want to promote. And finally, before I get to some specifics, the 4 big legal issues I think can be described as following. And that is, should enhancement be mandatory, encouraged, permitted, or prohibited? And the 5th big issue is, how will you go about achieving any one of those? So that raises questions of process, public participation, due process under the law, so forth and so on. Those I think, are the really 5 big issues, and then all other legal implications sort of fall from those. And that if you have, as a society, if we have a good handle on where we want to go with enhancement, then it seems to me that the specifics, if you will, can be worked out. But the big question is, toward what end, and how do we want to get there? Which, of course, is a legal issue as well as ethical issue as well as a legal issue. And I think the answers will differ depending upon whether we're talking about restoration, people who have lost some capability and we want to restore that capability. Many of you were involved in that activity, or whether we're talking about something beyond the norm, which raises another issue, and that is, it would be very nice if the law could be precise in defining terms like restoration and beyond the norm. Without that kind of precision, we could spend years in litigation debating what those terms mean. And we have, with regard to other terms in the past, that we may look at now and think, why didn't they think of that in the first place? So the law, again, should be stable, should be as precise as possible, but also allow for some flexibility. So let me raise a few very practical, specific legal implications. I'll start with a big one. And that is enhancement a human right? Put another way, is enhancement a means of free expression, preserving or advancing human dignity, or achieving equal rights under international declarations, treaties, and covenants, or national laws? Perhaps some of you have heard of something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been ratified by almost every nation on the planet. What it did was establish obligations for nation states towards their citizens. And one of the most interesting articles in the Declaration is the following, and I am editing just to save some time. But basically it says, everyone has the right to share in the advancement of science and its benefits. So it would not be surprising to me if proponents of enhancement talk about it in terms of human rights. All human beings, for the most part, tend to work on improving themselves. We all want to get better. As we've heard, there are many different means of doing that. Traditional means of education, and perhaps some newfound means related to computer-human interface, pharmaceuticals, so forth and so on. So I think restricting enhancement could be viewed as infringing on some basic human freedom to improve one's lot in life. And I think this can indeed be an argument that will be raised. It will be raised by others, mostly those who end up to be on the lowest ladders of society. They will say, look, if we don't have a chance for improvement, then we're going to basically be forced by the rest of society to adhere to some societally imposed standard of what normal is, and that will often leave us out. So I think there's a lot to say about sort of the human rights issue and how people might come at this in international law or in national laws as well. Initially, many of the enhancements we've heard about, or many of the enhancement that might come from, or purpose served is to go beyond the norm, likely to emerge from enhancements that were originally grounded in helping restore normal function. We heard a lot of that today. That's the way things often get started. Think about helping disabled walk, or those with dementia to fight memory loss. And we learn a lot about the benefits and risks on humans, benefits and risks of new research and technology through research on humans that is heavily regulated in most democratic countries, and also recognizes that people with serious health problems should be permitted to take certain risks that healthy people should not. But as we've also heard today, super enhancements are likely to be marketed to the able-bodied in order to make them better, whatever that might mean. So we should also ask ourselves, what type of legal regime should be in place to protect these people from the inevitable shortcomings of the free market, because we'll suddenly be moving from a sort of safe environment, safe in quotes, which is the research context, heavily regulated through various ethics committees, policies, and laws, to a situation which may not be as regulated as the case might be. Speaking of the marketplace, how might enhancement affect legal rights in the workplace? For example, if drugs would enable workers to work smarter, thereby increasing productivity and reducing accidents in the workplace, should employers be able to include such drugs in the employee contract? In a competitive market where jobs are scarce, how free are employees to say no to ingesting a drug or wearing a helmet that might stimulate their prefrontal cortex? The point I mentioned earlier about the effects of enhancement on others raises issues of liability. Who is liable for an enhancement that's gone wrong? What does it even mean for an enhancement to go wrong? And in many ways, the thing we think of right away is, of course, physical harm. And of course, that's the case. But what if your enhancement, something that I cannot afford, creates some sort of injustice for me, making it difficult for me to achieve my life's goal? Should I have legal recourse? And then finally, should superhumans be required to disclose their advanced status when competing against those without similar status? How about when seeking access to scarce resources, when running for public office? And to whom should they disclose? Should they forfeit some privacy rights in order to gain superhuman status in a world where not everyone can? So that's a quick overview of some of the legal issues that I think emerge as we begin to think about this topic. And I'll pass it on to my colleague to go take the next step.
You can keep the microphone, but I'll have the flicker.
Okay.
Thank you. So I just have a couple of slides that may appear, if I'm lucky. So until that appears, I just wanted to draw attention to a couple of ways in which enhancement is already sort of present in our student population. And I certainly go along with the idea. I certainly go along with the idea that the genie is out of the bottle. There are measurements of the degree to which students in the United States are using, or should I say abusing, stimulants in order to get on with their studies, and they range from somewhere between 5 and 34% of students. But in the UK, you can see here that I've tried to plot the number of Ritalin prescriptions in the UK. You can see there's a very clear linear increase there, and I've put the most recent piece of data that I could find there. So it's not as if we're turning away from the use of these drugs because we fear side effects. I would say that the increase in Ritalin prescription is largely due to increasing cultural acceptance of the advantages of medication in that way. Also, there is something which hasn't been mentioned very much, which is transcranial direct current stimulation, or sometimes called transcranial electric stimulation, which involves applying a very small current across the scalp. And there have been several studies, some of them involving maths amongst young adults, that show improved learning rates, very radically improved learning rates as well. This is a very cheap, easily put together way of enhancing. I'm certainly not recommending it to anybody, but you'll see this is something I found on the internet last week. There are numerous sites like this that have already got hold of this idea, and there are sort of self-help sites to help you put together these devices yourself, and videos you can watch of people reporting the effects of them. And this is not a joke. I mean, this is quite serious, and I understand that already research is underway applying these techniques with children, school-age children as well, normal, healthy school-age children. So this is certainly something which needs to be discussed. We need to make a decision, or we need to make a decision really as a culture about how we feel about these things. And at the moment, the opinions range widely. So it's not difficult to find neuroscientists who will speak out in quite an ecstatic manner about the possibilities of cognitive enhancement. And yet at the same time, in a survey that we did of educators, head teachers, trainee teachers, we found that the views were very different, and there is a wide-ranging distrust and concern about these types of cognitive enhancement techniques. And the questions run deep. What is the difference between designing and rearing a child? I think that's something we've already spoken about. Indeed, you had a wonderful performance recently. What is the difference between achievement with and without enhancement? And, according to who? Who should actually be making that judgment? And I think most centrally, what is actually education about? Is it a means of social engineering? Or is it actually just a product in a free market for knowledge? These are my thoughts, and these are sort of gathered together. I mean, I'm not putting forward any particular ethical viewpoint, other than the fact that we do really need to start discussing these things. I think one of the wonderful things about this event is that it is drawing attention to these issues, and hopefully will stimulate a wider debate. Because when it comes to ethical decisions, there's rarely a rule book that you can apply, and it does come down to some sort of cultural consensus. And for that cultural consensus to be appropriate, it needs to be informed. And at the moment, educational institutions are not even really discussing these issues, even though, as I've just shown you, they are already influencing student achievement. So some of the things that have been brought up in other meetings that I've attended, but also here today, concerns about side effects and the long-term effects of some of these methods, the devaluation of normal achievement, in terms of achievement as something which has an emotional and a motivational, intrinsic motivational basis. The inequality that may arise, will these methods increase the poverty gap in education? Will there be a pressure to take them? And I feel that pressure sometimes when I see my colleagues taking these drugs and their careers are progressing faster than mine. Genetics, I mean, we were talking about gene therapy today, and of course, the more these methods become refined, the easier it is for them to be used illegally, or in terms of some sort of eugenics approach, or possibly I can imagine even a cultural eugenics, in the sense that once genetic information becomes more freely available, it's going to be possible for people to make all sorts of decisions that will ultimately disadvantage some members of the population. Cognitive societies, in terms of transmitting cognition through technology, what aspects of cognition will actually be transmitted? I think possibly this is undervaluing the role of language as a cultural mediator. Because when we use language, we often find it very restricting, but one of the reasons for that is that the words carry an accumulated set of values and history with them. And I think possibly there are some sorts of technological communication which would be possible to divert and actually avoid those things, detour around them. And speed of thought technology, in a situation where you are constructing the cognition with technology at the speed of thought, and you are making decisions with technology, who is ultimately responsible for the decisions that are made? That seems to me a critical issue. And we talked about intent earlier, and there was a mention of it being a matter of subjectivity. There are aspects of subjectivity in terms of the ethical dilemmas that we're facing, but I don't think it's necessarily individuals on their own who should be making those subjective decisions, at least not as part of a much wider dialogue that aims at some sort of cultural information distribution and discussion and ultimately cultural acceptance of some form of ethics about what we want from these sorts of ventures. Thank you.